1 year after explosions crippled gas pipelines linking Russia and Germany, investigators have yet to determine who's responsible. Hello, I'm Arnold Knight, and this is The Heat. Denmark, Sweden and Germany are investigating who sabotaged the Nord Stream pipelines last September in the Baltic Sea. Norwegian scientists told the Guardian newspaper man-made explosives were used to attack the pipelines, and there's seismic evidence of 4 explosions. The Nord Stream 1 had been operational since 2011. Nord Stream 2 was ready to go. It never carried any gas. Once operational, though, it would have doubled the flow of gas between Russia and Germany. Well, for more now on the Nord Stream investigation, let's bring in our panel. Joining us from London is Klisman Murati. He's the founder of Pareto Economics and the creator of the Global Power Index. Also with us from New York, Aaron Maté is the host of Pushback with Aaron Maté on the Grayzone. Here in Washington, D.C., Anton Fedyashin is a professor of history at American University, and right here with us in the studio, Klaus Larres is a fellow at the Wilson Center and is a professor of history and international relations at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Thank you, everyone, for being with us. Klaus, great to have you with us in the studio, in person. Let me start with you. It's been a year since these explosions crippled the pipelines, and as I said, Denmark, Sweden and Germany are carrying out investigations, but after a year, nothing, no report. We still don't know who carried this out. And these are countries with great resources to investigate this. Why has it been so difficult to tell us what happened?
Well, the report is expected to come out pretty soon. That is what all 3 countries have said. They also said it's a very complex investigation. They want to be very thorough. They want to take their time. But I think we have had some, at least preliminary results. They were published by a German newspaper, Der Spiegel, and a German TV station recently. And it's, as you said, there were 4 explosions. It probably was very likely a state actor, not a non-state actor, as was claimed for some time. And also it seems to be the Ukrainians were involved. We don't know whether the Ukrainian leadership in Kiev was really behind it, or whether it was the Ukrainian military, or perhaps even a group associated with the Ukrainian military. But everything points towards Ukraine. Zelensky himself, the president, probably did not know and deliberately not know about it, so he could, of course, deny it. But it doesn't seem that it was Russia in the end, as was claimed for quite some time.
So the initial evidence that you're talking about that's been published in the German press points to Ukraine?
Yes.
Okay. Aaron Maté, the prize-winning journalist, the United States prize-winning journalist Seymour Hersh, he's been doing a lot of reporting on this, extensive reporting, very deep reporting on the explosions. His reporting, however, places the blame on the United States Central Intelligence Agency. In his most recent article, which was published on the Substack platform, this is what he said. The article was headlined, "A Year of Lying About Nord Stream." Hersh writes, and I'm quoting him here, "The Biden administration blew up the pipelines, but the action had little to do with winning or stopping the war in Ukraine. It resulted from fears in the White House that Germany would waver and turn on the flow of Russia gas." The view was that Germany and other NATO countries would fall under Russian influence, seriously undermining US dominance and primacy in Europe. What do you make of that?
Well, I have to admit to being biased. I'm a big fan of Seymour Hersh, and he has a track record of accurate, impactful journalism, from the My Lai massacre in Vietnam to the Abu Ghraib torture scandal in Iraq, among many other historic stories. So when he comes out with a story based on a extensive investigation he's done based on a source inside the US government, I tend to believe him. But then you have to look at the other evidence. First of all, the cover story we've gotten about Ukraine possibly being responsible, it's been doled out to us in slow doses. Initially, the New York Times came out with a story saying that US intelligence thinks it came from Ukraine, but they weren't exactly sure, and gave us very little specifics. And then we got more details coming out in the German press. But the story there, we have to believe, is that Ukrainian operatives using a relatively small yacht carried out this daring operation. And I just don't think Ukraine has the capacity to do something like this. This was a really elaborate bombing. It requires equipment, it requires decompression chambers, none of which I think could fit on that yacht. And that yacht story to me is just too convenient. It sounds to me like a cover story. Now contrast that with the US, which had not only the motive, but also the expressed intent. So even before Russia invaded, you had Joe Biden vowing that if Russia invades, Nord Stream would not go ahead. And he was asked at a news conference with Olaf Scholz standing right next to him, well, how could you undermine Nord Stream given that it's not in your waters? And Joe Biden smugly said, trust me, we can do that. Victoria Nuland, a senior official under Biden, boasted that the Nord Stream was bombed. She said that we're gratified, speaking on behalf of the administration, that Nord Stream is now a hunk of metal at the bottom of the sea. And the motive was long expressed. Well before the war, Trump tried to kill Nord Stream by imposing sanctions because they do not want to have closer ties between the U.S. and Russia. Between Russia and Germany, because it's long been understood that if Russia, which has all these natural resources, teams up with the economic heart of Europe, which is Germany, that would undermine U.S. hegemony. And after the war starts, taking Nord Stream offline would undermine any sort of off-ramp that Germany might have to back out of the proxy war coalition. So you have the intent, you have the motive, and you have one of the most accomplished journalists in history saying it was the U.S. And so I tend to believe it was the U.S.
Klisman, Murati, let's look at the economic impact of this. And again, I'm going to go back to the Seymour Hersh report. He says in that report that the initial goal was to deter Russia from its involvement in Ukraine. But as time went by, that goal evolved into then stopping Germany from having any second thoughts about breaking those sanctions and restoring its relationship with Russia and continuing to import gas from Russia. But, you know, if we look at what's happened right now with the destruction of this pipeline, Germany is now in recession, its economy is stagnating, wages and consumption is down. To what extent was the loss of that inexpensive energy from Russia responsible for the plight that Germany finds itself in right now?
Well, you know, the Nord Stream 2 wasn't even online, so the fact that the pipeline was blown up doesn't, you know, cause any of the issues that you mentioned to the German economy. The German economy has been suffering for at least the last 10 years with the stagnant productivity, with demographics which are against its favor, with low numbers as it relates to GDP as well. And what's been happening, compounding COVID, compounding the war in Ukraine, as a side shock, the energy issue that it faces now being cut off from Russian gas supply has really culminated in a lot of chaos in the country. So as it relates to Germany's energy future, I don't think they're going to sit still and just take this. They are looking for different alternatives. In fact, about 3 days ago, Germany and the UK signed a hydrogen deal together for R&D endeavors to work on energy projects in relation to hydrogen, which will again put them in a very good place in the future to diversify the energy security. I think the fact that what's happened, which is a negative to Germany, at least opens up the conversation for different energy alternative futures for Europe and Germany in particular. And I hope that the government as well as private actors can work together to find solutions, long-term solutions, which again make their energy infrastructure much more robust than what we have seen in the last 30-odd years.
Right, Klisman, talking about those alternative sources of energy, and we look at another consequence, a very senior European Union energy official who's called Dieter Jorgensen, he says Europe will now have to rely on fossil fuels for decades to come. I mean, I don't think I've seen any figures on how much of a setback this is to climate change efforts, but I mean, what are we to make of that and German decision-making on this issue?
Well, it's difficult because, you know, Germany has been the de facto leader in the EU for a green energy revolution. So what's been happening, again, for different reasons, being, the war being the biggest one and a sort of a cut due to sanctions also on Russia by the Germans, has really put the focus on Germany's energy future and whether they can actually stand by the commitments to their green future in the spotlight. They've also, you know, loosened regulations on construction because, you know, it's because of inflation and other things. Housing has become a lot more expensive for people, and new builds are becoming more expensive. So they're wanting to make the ability to create new homes for German people much more affordable, which has then allowed them to loosen regulation on the kinds of building materials that construction companies can use for these projects, which again will hit into their emissions targets. And it's hard because having a long-term vision will obviously be faced with short-term needs, current needs, geopolitical needs, economic needs, and it's very difficult for a country to maintain. So the best kind of future is one in which they can hopefully maintain their vision as well as enact it through policy, but they have to face with the realities of today's world, which is going to be very difficult to circumvent.
Anton, Fedyashin, Europe initially blamed Russia for these explosions on the Nord Stream pipelines, although one European official did subsequently say that there was no evidence to show that Russia was responsible for this. But, you know, the pipelines are not operational anymore. So what's been the impact on Russia?
Not terribly much in terms of gas supplies to Europe, because the Russians built the pipeline running through the Black Sea, and now Turkey's on the receiving end of the largesse for transit fees. The Russians are still, by the way, using the Ukrainian pipelines, but that contract will run out at the end of 2024, and we'll see what happens then. Now, the Russians did take a hit on the amount of gas that they were selling to Europe. That goes without saying, but they have successfully redirected their energy flows, diversified, one would say, their energy flows through the south, but also towards China. And then the Europeans, remember, are still buying Russian gas. They're just buying it in a much more expensive way by buying Russian LNG, which is arriving in European ports in enormous amounts. The Russians are actually selling the same gas, but they're making a lot more money off of it. Let me just go back for a second, Anna, if I may, to something like Klisman said. Remember that the green transition, which I'm all for as someone who actually bikes to work, unlike most of the green warriors that I know, the green transition is a long-term process, and the big part of the reason why the Germans had the Nord Stream 1 and ultimately Nord Stream 2 built for themselves, they convinced the Russians to join them in what was certainly a mutually beneficial project, was that the natural gas from Russia was supposed to be cheap, reliable, and it was supposed to be a bridge for this long-term transition away from nuclear, away from coal, away from fossil fuels towards a green future. Without that bridge, this transition is going to be A, more expensive, B, it will take longer, and we see the economic repercussions for Germany already. And the long-term problem for this is not just the economy of Germany, but the fact that Germany has been the engine of the EU, of the European economies, and a slowdown in Germany will have a knock-on effect on the rest of Europe. So if the Ukrainians are indeed behind this, which frankly, personally, I doubt, I'll have to see some more evidence behind this, but even if they are behind this, they really shot themselves in the foot, because if they expect to be to receive aid from the West, from Europe, from the EU specifically, for rebuilding, and for essentially the Ukrainian state to be bankrolled, which is unfortunately what is happening right now, then they're killing the goose that's laying the golden egg, at least in the EU.
Klaus, what is your view on what Anton was telling us, that Germany is now paying more for its energy because it now comes as liquefied natural gas? Its economy is in trouble. But Anton also pointed out that Germany is really the engine of Eurozone growth.
This is very true, but even if the pipeline had never been blown up, the Germans would not take in gas and oil from Russia, not after the outbreak of that war of aggression by Russia. They could not do that. There would be enormous pressure from everyone in the Western world, and also by their own population to some extent. Just a word about that. Ukraine seems to have been forgiven for having blown up the pipeline. At least all evidence seems to point into that direction, that it was Ukraine. No one in the West plays it up too much. No one criticizes the Ukrainians too much, because everyone knows that war needs to be won. So in a way, they play it down. They are not making a fuss about Ukraine having done something highly illegal, of course, against one of their partners, which is Germany. And Simon Hirsch is a great journalist. He was one in the past, but he has been discredited. His article was based on one source, and that was about it. So no one really believes that story that the United States did it. However, whether the US knew about it, that's a totally different matter. But I don't think they did it themselves.
Yeah, that criticism has been leveled at him. But getting back to what you were saying earlier on, that Germany couldn't be seen to be buying energy from Russia or Russia's oil because of the conflict in Ukraine. Yeah. Germany continues to use Russian energy, doesn't it?
To some extent, but they're trying to wean themselves off that, and they have done that very, very successfully. And also the German people have started to save on oil and gas. They saved over 5% last year, and German companies complain an awful lot about the high energy prices. There was a summit only a few days ago between the Chancellor and leading CEOs, where the CEOs tried to put pressure on Scholz to give them subsidies for being competitive in the global market, because they say German companies are losing out globally because of our high energy prices. And the government so far hasn't promised that they will come up with subsidies for these companies. But Germany is suffering, definitely. And one reason is the high energy prices, clearly. There are other issues like a lack of exports. There's a global difficulties, including in China. So Germany doesn't send out as many experts to other countries as they used to do.
Aaron, both Russia and China are calling for an impartial investigation into the explosions under the auspices of the United Nations. Here is Russia's United Nations ambassador, Vasily Nebenzia, talking. Let's listen to him.
Madam President, I would like to remind you that we are not talking about some prank carried out by hooligans. We are talking about a terrorist act that targeted international pipeline infrastructure and led to massive economic and environmental consequences for a number of states. Nobody denies that it was committed using an explosive device, therefore there is every reason to believe that it falls under the International Convention for the Suppression of Terrorist Bombings of December 15, 1997, to which Germany, Denmark and Sweden are all parties.
So, Aaron, do you see UN involvement in some kind of investigation? And if the United States, for that matter, thinks that Russia is responsible or Ukraine is responsible, it wouldn't stand in the way of a transparent investigation, would it?
It wouldn't, I don't think. And I think the fact that they are opposed to such an investigation is very telling. By the way, Brazil also supports the Russian and Chinese calls for an investigation. And for anyone who actually cares about finding out the truth, I don't see why it wouldn't be worth supporting. The same with, as Seymour Hersh points out, the Biden administration, if it wanted to, could task the intelligence community, the most sweeping intelligence capabilities in the world, to look into what happened. But the Biden administration, as far as we know, hasn't done that, which raises another question: why not? Well, I think the answer is obvious. They don't want to know what it will uncover because, again, this is a matter of one subjective opinion, but I think it's pretty clear that the U.S. did it. And on the point about Seymour Hersh's anonymous source, which was raised just now, Hersh has been reporting based on anonymous sources for decades. And there's a long pattern, if you go back to his stories, of him coming out with something, the government denies it, only for him later to be proved exactly correct. In the 70s, he came out with stories about how the CIA was engaged in acts of domestic repression, spying on anti-war activists, among other subterfuge. CIA, of course, denied it initially. Eventually, a top official admitted it under oath in Congress. And the same thing with the Abu Ghraib story, the same thing with the killing of Osama bin Laden, where he pointed out that the official story we got about that operation was not accurate. And again, he was subsequently corroborated. And what's interesting is, if you look back at all the lies we've been told to justify wars, the war in Iraq, the wars in Libya, how many of those stories were based on multiple anonymous sources? So I will take multiple anonymous sources in discredited publications like the New York Times selling us on wars based on lies. Yeah. I will take Seymour Hersh's one source anytime over any of them.
Okay. One other thing, and this is getting to the conflict itself, Aaron. President Zelensky was in Washington last week. He did the rounds. He was at the White House. He met with members of Congress. He's been promised hundreds of billions more in aid, military aid, although to be fair, that most of that money is going to go to U.S. arms dealers and manufacturers. I mean, it's become a political issue in this country because there are now some Republicans who are saying enough, we can't do any more of this. But given all of that, I mean, do you sense any urgency on the part of the United States to at least encourage Ukraine to negotiate its way out of this?
None that I can see, because again, I don't think the U.S. agenda here is to defend Ukraine and to bring this war to an end. I think the U.S. agenda is what has been openly admitted by top Biden officials. Lloyd Austin said the goal is to weaken Russia. Jake Sullivan said that the goal is to hand Russia a strategic defeat in Ukraine and hurt elements of its national power. None of that has anything to do with saving Ukrainian lives. That is a policy of using Ukraine to bleed Russia. And so accordingly, even though Ukrainian lives are being sacrificed by the tens of thousands, I don't see an urgency to end this war because, as Lindsey Graham said, as long as we support Ukraine with weapons, they will fight to the last person. Oliver North, who's a former Reagan administration official, he was on Fox News, and he said that it's their blood and our bullets. And he was saying that it's a positive thing because it's of no cost to the U.S. So as long as that's the driving mentality in Washington, this bipartisan neocon mentality of using another country to bleed an adversary, in this case, using Ukraine to bleed Russia, this war will continue.
Anton, let's look at what's going on in Russia right now. Russia announced this week that it will raise defense spending by almost 70%. That's a lot. Spending is set at $111 billion. Is there any inclination on the part of Moscow to bring this conflict to an end?
Well, there is, in terms of coming to the negotiating table, which the Russians have said repeatedly they're ready to do, but on their terms, which are unacceptable to Ukraine. So I don't think we're going to see an end to this until one side or the other basically breaks. And the way that the counteroffensive has been going over the past 4 months, taking into account that the New York Times just admitted in an article, which those of us who have been carefully monitoring this war from Ukrainian and Russian and other sources, that the Russians have actually taken more territory since the counteroffensive started than the Ukrainians have. In other words, that the sum total has been lost to Ukraine, although not a large one. But when you factor in the amount of people that Ukraine is losing, the amount of soldiers, and the piles of Western equipment, to the point where the Ukrainians have stopped using tanks and IFVs to bring soldiers and help them operate on the front lines. They drop them off, and then these poor guys walk the rest of the way. This is not going in Ukraine's favor at all. And if this is a war of attrition, which it certainly is, it means it's not really about territory. It's about losses of men and material. The Russians are still in the position to burn through more, basically, with a larger economy, a larger population, and certainly a much larger productive capacity than Ukraine, Europe, and so far, even the U.S. combined.
Klisman, the Russian President, Vladimir Putin, he says that the country's economy is stable. In fact, there was a report in the Financial Times just a couple of weeks ago, or about a week ago, which said that the Russian economy has shown resilience in the face of the sanctions that it's facing right now. What is your assessment of the Russian economy, and can it sustain a conflict that could last many more years?
The Russian economy, despite what President Putin says, has gone through a very fundamental change. This is reflected profoundly, I suppose, by seeing only its exchange reserves, its FX denomination with the USD, right? So for one USD, you get 100 rubles. That has hit the 100 rubles mark, which is really weakening the currency of Russia. And then what does Russia do afterwards? Russia then relies on the BRICS to coalesce around an idea of an anti-Western sort of mode, where it can bring the resources and focus and attention of the BRICS to countering in some way, shape, or form these Western institutions, these Bretton Woods institutions. And also what it's done is that it's put Russia firmly on the path of forced collaboration with China, obviously, and looking towards alternative partners, which are nowhere near the strength and power of Western institutions combined, he is now looking towards other partnerships that will lead Russia, hopefully, out of this quagmire that they find themselves in. But something else, which I see, which really leads Russia into a very weak spot, is the fact that it's got a lot of key man risk. Meaning Putin is the one man in charge of the country, and whatever he says goes, essentially. And if for whatever reason Putin is not in power anymore into the future, this, I think, will see a fundamental, again, shift to the Russian economy, probably to somewhere near a change that we saw post Cold War. Okay, because he's been in power, entrenched in power for so long, and institutions led by him have been there for so long also.
Okay.
So this is why I believe that Putin's comments aren't true.
Yeah.
Russia has faced a lot of issues internally. A lot of people have left the country due to forced conscription also, which has led their economy in a very, very weak way. So what it has going for itself now is, again, it's energy, number one. It's military might, number two. This is all measured by our global power index, by the way. And we see Russia really suffering on other metrics, which it needs to be strengthened on in order to really be a truly global superpower.
Okay. Klaus, one other point, other development that we've seen recently, and that Poland says it will no longer supply weapons to Ukraine. In fact, the NATO Secretary General, Jens Stoltenberg, he says that NATO will stand with Ukraine. That includes Poland, no matter how long it takes. But what do you make of this decision by Poland?
Well, there's been a dispute between Ukraine and Poland about grain, Ukrainian grain, which is coming onto the market in Poland. And the Poles have overreacted. But I was assured this very morning that by Polish officials, the government policy in Poland towards Ukraine has not changed. I think what the issue is that the Poles are actually running out of ammunition and arms they can possibly deliver to Ukraine. So I don't think that the Poles are suddenly have turned against supporting Ukraine at all. That dispute, of course, hasn't helped, but it is a matter of being able to help the Ukrainians. And apparently the Poles want to continue delivering Soviet-style, Soviet-made weapons and ammunition and tanks to Poland, but keep the more modern weapons for their own defense at home. At least that is the position right now. But that dispute, of course, isn't good. There shouldn't be such a dispute. Yeah.
Aaron, I've only got about 30 seconds left, but do you see any significant movement from the United States to end this conflict before the 2024 election?
I don't, unfortunately. I think the Biden administration, for its own political prospects, needs this war to continue through the election. And I do believe that that's how the policy is being oriented, unfortunately.
Okay, and that is where we have to leave it. Thank you to all of you for being with us. That is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anton in Washington, D.C.